going to be for Joel SKOUSEN, one of the best newsletters you can get literally on earth. Many times he has alternative viewpoints that I totally agree with, such as the dangers of Russia and a future conflict, the policies of globalism and so on. Joel, welcome back to the program. I'm sure every Friday you have a newsletter they can obtain a copy or a sample by emailing at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. And it's well worth reading. I tell people, if you want to be informed, this is one of the most important newsletters. It's on the front page link on our website, Nutrimedical.com. And I'm sure since the Friday you've got a few other issues and ideas percolating. Let's run through all of the issues that are going around, because it's been, I think, at least a month and a half or more since we've had you on the program. Usually we try to get you on at least once a month to give us your wisdom.
Yes, well, thank you, Bill. It's good to be with you and your listeners. Much has happened since the election of Donald Trump, and the thing that is, people are most watching is how much will he compromise and how much will the powers that be co-opt Donald Trump, and we're kind of seeing that in process. It hasn't been a slam dunk for the establishment people that surround Donald Trump. People like Kellyanne Conway are trying very hard to make sure that Trump doesn't totally betray his supporters, knowing as a pollster that there's going to be hell to pay if they do. So the picks that Donald Trump has tended to make in his cabinet are people who are conservatives, but who are and not bona fide, how should I say, members of the establishment, but they're open to it. There are people who have compromised before. There are people who are leaning towards a neocon position in foreign policy, and so I'm a little concerned about how things are shaping up.
Yeah, I saw some of the people like former Goldman Sachs Mnuchin, Ross. The consideration of Bolton for Attorney General. He's got a pretty long list. So, yes, there are some concerns, aren't there?
Yeah, there really are. And a lot of it is, who he's even considering. I mean, let's look at just some of the things this past week. This week he met with Al Gore at the invitation of his daughter Ivanka. And, she's married to basically a Democratic liberal. And but Al Gore said they had a wonderful meeting and talked about climate change, and that Trump was very open to his claims on climate change. And this differs significantly from the skepticism that Donald Trump talked about during the campaign. Obviously, Donald Trump reads a lot of the alternative news media and believes it, but because he doesn't study the things in depth, he doesn't have any defenses when he gets up against very well-educated leftists and liberals who push their point of view. For example, he met with David Petraeus. That's like, in terms of interviewing him for Secretary of State, that's like having Hillary Clinton as your Secretary of State. This guy is joined at the hip with Clinton. There were over 1,000 emails in the CENTCOM, or Central Command headquarters, where Petraeus was, with Hillary Clinton. And none of those emails show up on the Hillary Clinton server that she turned over to the government, meaning that they were all deleted. So there's obviously a lot of, of course, Petraeus has had an email scandal, not email scandal, but a classified information scandal of his own, having revealed classified information to a mistress. He was got off easy with a slap on the hands, misdemeanor, and probation. So, it's kind of disturbing, that Donald Trump would even consider people like this to be in his cabinet. Then there's Mitt Romney, who was part of the Never Trump movement. And it looks as if, because they're continuing to search out new things, that there's been a lot of backlash against the Romney and Petraeus, and they're looking for other people.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why they leak these types of people that they're interviewing, is so that they can get a reaction from people, both from the establishment side and from the supporter side.
Do you think that's part of the psychology of Trumpism, is to leak people that obviously his base will revolt against, and for people that are in the know, that are more knowledgeable, to say, hey, what are you doing? Because, even though Trump is going to have a central idea, if he has a wrongly assembled cabinet, they're going to make decisions on the spot or start leaning toward things, or have got alliances behind the scenes that are going to compromise his presidency.
Yeah, I do think that that's the purpose. I mean, all of the picks so far, have been, nominal conservatives, not really deep into the globalist direct conspiratorial camp, except for people like Rudolph Giuliani. I mean, there's a guy who was part of the 9/11 conspiracy, and he's a good friend of Donald Trump's. And, Alex Jones thinks that Donald Trump really knows about conspiracy. Well,
I don't think so.
I don't think so, because you couldn't know about conspiracy and have Rudy Giuliani as one of your friends. He knew about Building 7 being imploded.
Yeah, exactly. Well, for example, 9/11, we know that Giuliani and the Port Authority of New York knew that the World Trade Center towers was a controlled demolition. I mean,
that's right.
You have to understand that. And if you don't understand that basic thing, which is a metallurgical and a structural steel issue, and he's a major, he's not an idiot, he has to understand that even rumors who go around would give him some pause to think, is this guy really on our side or not? Same as people like Chris Christie, who's now, of course, with his Bridgegate. I'm concerned. I want feedback going back from the base to Trump to make sure to keep him on track. And number one, to train him. The problem with Trump is he's got very good skill sets of trying to select people to, say, build buildings. But his knowledge base and his ability to discern and his level is, a mile wide and a quarter millimeter thick. And a good example was seeing Al Gore standing outside the Trump Towers and looking very pleased at his discussion. I mean, I'm an environmentalist. I was an oceanographer in the early 70s and a charter member of the founding of Greenpeace. And when it got taken over by the globalists, I got so damn mad, I quit Greenpeace. And I can tell you, the pseudo-environmentalists, there's money, trillions, in global warming and in controlling the economy, controlling carbon credits. And these maniacs, like Al Gore, while flying around in this Airstream 3 jet, private jet, and creating carbon credits, which is perfectly, to be honest with you, as long as they're not creating pollution, carbon dioxide is turned to oxygen. It's called a carbon-oxygen cycle. And if you sink carbon dioxide and carbon into the bottom of the ocean, because I met with Dr. Isley, the head of the Vitamin Cottage, and a PhD physicist who is the founder in 1958 of the World Constitution Parliament Association under the United Nations. They had an intention to start all this foolishness about carbon credits, and this is even before, in the 1970s, they said, we're heading into an ice age, which we are. It's called a Maunder minimum, and that's happening as we speak, and these fools keep on lying and fiddling the data in Britain, tying directly to the United Nations climate control people. These people are liars. And the fact is that there's a lot of other drivers, but mankind is a minor factor. Yes, we're polluting, and we can stop putting dirty coal from China into the atmosphere that puts up mercury. But beyond that, human beings have very little effect on the climate. It's ridiculous. Yeah,
absolutely true. And but it's very, exactly as you said, he has picked up a smattering of information as a person who's a populist who's looking for hot button issues that are very popular and hot buttons with people. I mean, he's picked up on everything from 9/11 to other things, but he doesn't have any depth, and so when he makes statements, he cannot defend it. His statements are always somewhat inaccurate, and he's backtracking as we speak. For example, staff announced today, Anthony Scaramucci, senior advisor to the Trump administration, told a group of business leaders that Trump is not going to rip up NAFTA. After drumming that, I'm going to tear up all these agreements and renegotiate them, he said, no, he's not going to scrap them. He's just going to try to get a better deal. And
I think that may actually be, in some ways, like the healthcare thing. I don't think scrapping Obamacare is the right way. I think you need to gut it from the inside by changing a lot of statutes, getting rid of malpractice, giving portability of insurance, getting rid of fee-for-service, doing lots of things that structurally will change how they purchase drugs. I think that NAFTA, the best way is to kind of gut it from the inside rather than trying to get rid of it, because you're going to have a trade deal with Canada to even bring the oil and gas across the pipeline from the Turner Valley and from the oil tar sands in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the problem is he's not transparent in what he's going to replace it with, so he takes off his base by saying, I'm not going to do it now. And
Well, here's the trouble, Bill, with these agreements, NAFTA and GATT and all of these.
Right.
They're thousands of pages long, and they have all kinds. I mean, they need to be scrapped because they have very little to do with the actual trade. Most of these things are establishment international regulatory committees that are beyond legislative control.
I get your point then, so I revise that. Get rid of it. Now, with Obamacare, the problem is that if they try to just delete it and replace it with the many millions of people, 22 million I think it is, that are getting insurance through this, they have to structurally do something a lot more aggressive, which is to allow portability of insurance, get rid of malpractice, get rid of fee-for-service, a whole lot of things that are much more aggressive than any nation on earth has ever done, even South Korea. So
the big problem with Obamacare, of course, is is two things: the actual mandate to participate, which he has vowed that he will get rid of,
right,
and number two is the mandate for insurance companies to accept prior existing conditions without supposedly increasing rates. But that is what's driving or giving the insurance companies an excuse to drive rates higher.
Of course. So the way that you solve that is what we should be doing eventually is actually getting rid of insurance altogether. But we do it in steps, like start off with 10% with a value-added tax and having something like health providers working on salary and having a system where Ahmed is done there too, because one of our biggest costs of manufacturing is just occupational medicine. We can't compete with, say, cars built in Oshawa, Ontario, because it's $10,000 to $12,000 more to build a vehicle there because their Ahmed is folded into their health care. It's not here, and it's ridiculously expensive. I know as an Ahmed director, I can't see how we can compete with other countries, especially with our higher wages and Ahmed on top of it. This is beyond all these tariffs he talks about. Some of the things he's doing, like with Carrier and so on, are making special deals, but you need to have across-the-board policies that are going to change things rather than just special deals with this company and that company to look really good.
Well, especially because all you have to do now is threaten to leave the country, and you get special deals now. And of course, those are paid for by the taxpayer.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think that's going to work. It's another form of crony capitalism, but it's kind of like the reverse.
That's right. But you cannot, as Trump has said, maintain the policy of keeping people with prior existing conditions on essentially free insurance, subsidized by the government, and not expect rates to rise. You can't lower rates.
Well, there's a simple way of getting around that. Why don't they expand Medicare to include all these people with pre-existing conditions? And then the government's got control of it, and then put the doctors that are accepting it on a salary that would be equivalent to what they would get per hour if they're on fee-for-service, and then you get rid of malpractice. You do all kinds of other things to actually change the underlying structure of how they even obtain drugs. The same drugs purchased in America are multiples of the cost of the same pills and made in the same machine with French and English shipped to Quebec for their warehouse. So part of the problem with the healthcare system is it's literally ridiculous how it's run. It's ridiculous. And I know working as an Ahmed, as an internal medicine doc, taking over a locum of 4 general internists and intensive care unit in 1997 at the Swedish Hospital Medical Center, the largest ICU east of California. We had 126, 4 beds in 4 different pods. And I was paid $60 an hour without benefits, and the average person in the ICU was $35,000 to $90,000 per day, depending on all the things that we did for them. So, and when people ran out of insurance, they just pulled the plug. It's just really a crazy system. It's like going to Las Vegas.
Well, the reason ultimately that prices have risen so high in the medical field is because of insurance. You gave incentives through the tax to businesses to give insurance, and when people aren't paying the price, they have no resistance to say, no, I can't pay that. And so the prices just keep rising. And, there's no reason why each MRI should be $1,200 a piece. I mean, those machines have long since paid for themselves, and,
right.
But there is no resistance from the buyer.
The same thing as the surgical fees. Look at the surgical fees. You can have someone spend 3 or 4 hours in surgery and charge $250,000. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's just not right, and but it's gotten that way because they blamed the free market on it, but in fact it's government mandates and government tax incentives that built the insurance industry and reduced people's incentives not only to take care of their own health, but to also not resist price increases. I mean, people need to pay a price. Everybody needs to pay a price for medical care. just because if you don't, you have no incentive to lose weight, to exercise, to eat properly, and that's one of the reasons we're not going to solve the problem by simply making medicine free and cheaper on a government-subsidized basis.
Well, what I would do is put a value-added tax in the healthcare system that would run and give the tax breaks on their tax side. I wouldn't do it on the pay side. I get rid of insurance carriers altogether for at least 10% and let it grow. Over 10 or 15 years, it might grow to 40 or 50%, but you still have some corporations that want to do that. But if a business signs up with a plan that I'm putting together, and I'm going to try to send it through to Trump, because I think his policy of playing around the edges of healthcare is just going to roll it back 4 or 5 years, but it's not going to fix the problem. People are going to look at it in a few years and say, oh my God, the premiums have got back up to what it was before Trump was elected in 3 or 4 years. So, without changing the underlying problems, and the same thing goes with commerce. If you don't fix ACMED, if you don't fix some of these structural issues, you're not going to fix it. And you're right about NAFTA. I mean, some of the agreements there they leave the door wide open and to even things like the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Partnership, which would completely got our regulatory and our representative government to panels of lawyers, international lawyers. Pretty crazy.
Yes. Well, Trump has done some good things, like taking a call from the president of Taiwan.
I heard that Bob Dole arranged that, by the way. That's the rumor.
Yeah, I've heard that rumor too, and that's kind of interesting because Bob Dole is a globalist, and he's never been a real responsive person to Taiwan. He was in favor of the one China policy when he was in the Senate.
I'm wondering why that.
So you have to wonder what.
There. Yeah,
it may well be true, but it may well be, the globalists setting Donald Trump up for criticism, because certainly China has gone ballistic about you can't talk to one of our provinces without talking to us. And I'm hopeful that Trump will stand on this. Of course, Barack Obama in the White House media says, no, we still believe in the one China policy. I mean, this has been a globalist policy ever since Henry Kissinger, dumped Taiwan and put, it's one thing to let China enter the United Nations, but to give it a seat on the Security Council, that was purely a globalist move to give veto power to China.
Right.
Like they did.
And China doesn't deserve it. They don't deserve most the favored nation status. I mean, the way they run their country internally is disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are some things that give me hope, but I'm most concerned about a couple of appointments. One is that Mr. Pompeo, Congressman Pompeo, is from, I guess, Iowa, either Iowa or Kansas. Is that right?
Uh-huh.
In any case, he's for NSA spying, and he's for black sites, he's for torture. So clearly he's not going to stop any of the dark side operations in the CIA. And he was one of the few in the Trump cabinet that was never leaked to the press. It was just announced. And that sounds to me like an insider deal that his staff said, all right, this is going to be it. And, there's no other candidate. And so everyone else, was leaked and discussed, but not Pompeo.
Now, on the surface, I expect a lot of smoke and mirrors and fire, and I think there will be some deals that will temporarily halt a lot of the foolishness. But I think Trump is going to have to come down to the reality that, like you've said already, you need to repeal NAFTA, you need to not get involved with these international trade deals. It should be all bilateral. And you need to make sure you negotiate with nations like China a lot more firmly than the Obama globalists did. It's ridiculous. The same with Russia. I mean, Russia and their behavior is really unacceptable, isn't it?
Well, it depends. In Syria, it's not unacceptable.
No, Syria is fine, but in Ukraine and their missile systems they're deploying in Kaliningrad, these are all concerning.
Absolutely.
Back in a moment with Joel SKOUSEN. Turn to your issues of the Middle East with Russia.
Well, the important thing to realize here about Russia's intervention in the Middle East, which is a good thing, because the globalists have been attempting to take out Assad for years. They've manufactured false data about killing of civilians, about using chemical weapons. In fact, it was the U.S. who funneled chemical weapons into rebels to blame on Assad. So this has been a real trumped-up attack. But to get the big picture up, you have to analyze this. All is about Iran. Iran was under attack by the globalists for years, from 2004 clear through 2007 until Ron Paul started to run for election. That's the first time the government of the United States came out with a new intelligence estimate, the NIE, which said that Iran, we were mistaken, Iran isn't trying to do a nuclear weapon. I mean, this was just an incredible turnabout.
Yeah.
Nobody even questioned that it was, a manufactured problem. But in any case, what happened was that they had stepped down from Iran because of Ron Paul running for president. There was no sentiment for war, and that's why they stepped down with that excuse. And then they started it back up again after 2008. But Israel, at some point, told the globalists at a meeting in the city of London that we're not going to attack Iran on your behalf until you take out Syria, because Iran's going to retaliate, and Syria's right next door. They've got all these missiles, all these chemical weapons. They can overwhelm our Iron Dome missile defense system with a salvo of missiles, and so you got to take out Syria before. And that was 3.5 years ago.
Right.
The U.S. launched this Libyan-style no-fly zone, which isn't a no-fly zone. It's a no-fly for you guys, but it's cruise missiles. It's literally an attack, special forces coming in to undermine a government. And
right.
Syria's about to be taken down when Kerry went before this London press conference. A reporter said, hey, it's obvious you're going to attack Syria. Is there any way that Syria can avoid this? And Kerry, just off the top of his head said, yeah, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. And Assad and Russia said, we accept. And suddenly
Right.
the U.S. was stuck with this
Yeah.
agreement. And that was 3.5 years ago. And interestingly enough now, because then the taking down of Syria was put on hold because of the chemical weapons agreement, they had to have an excuse to stand down from Iraq. I mean, from Iran. They'd had 3 aircraft carrier groups off of Iran, constantly threatening to invade. Israel was going to start it, and then Iran predictably would have retaliated against U.S. troops, and that's one of the reasons why we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, was to have U.S. troops that would be there vulnerable to an Iranian attack. But the globalists have always wanted to take out Iran because it's the only Muslim country that is trying to become self-sufficient in its own weapons productions, missiles, nuclear weapons, all kinds of arms, chemical weapons. I mean, Iran's trying to do it because they're tired of being cannon fodder for the West or the East. They're trying to be independent in weapons, and the globalists cannot allow that. And that's why Iran is being targeted. So the U.S. approached Iran. It wasn't the other way around, and said, hey, let's make a deal. Now, there's very interesting things about the 3 major steps that went towards this nuclear arrangement. In each of these steps, the U.S. came in and made it easy for Iran to agree. In the first stage, they said, look, you don't hardly have to give up anything. We're going to let you continue. Just make this agreement with us. So Iran agrees, and then the U.S. makes a public announcement of what Iran had agreed to in the first level of meetings. And Iran said, wait a minute, we didn't agree to that. It was tightening the noose on them.
Right.
And they said, in fact, we've got the transcripts of the meeting. We can prove that we didn't agree with that. But because Iran was so anxious to get rid of the sanctions, they finally acceded to these excessive things that the U.S. had claimed publicly that Iran agreed to, and agreed to them. That happened in the second time, and that happened in the third time, the third and final meeting. The U.S. even added conventional weapons disarmament to the Iran agreement, even conventional weapons. And Iran finally agreed to it, but what's interesting is that nobody signed the agreement. They took the agreement to the UN Security Council, and they were the ones who put it into ink. But Iran and the U.S. has never signed this agreement.
So even with the money transfer, which was their money, and the other things, it's never signed. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, never signed. But the UN is prepared with this agreement to create a justification for an attack on Iran should anyone declare it in violation.
Those are amazing new factoids. Some of them I didn't know about the signing. What's Trump talking about when he says he's going to tear up the agreement? When it's just a Security Council automatic attack agreement. If any of those things are violated, and it's not even a signed agreement between Iran and the U.S., that's amazing. It's almost like first of all, it shows that Trump or Mattis don't understand
why the globalists have set up that agreement. It was set up, one, to delay having to attack Iran because they haven't got rid of Syria, and that's why the U.S. and British intelligence created ISIS. They took about 50% of the Syrian rebels, which they were funding, and said, all right, you're now ISIS. And they sent them off to attack Iraq, and eventually so they could get them back into Syria to undo Assad. And that's where Russia stepped in and said, all right, we know the U.S., is not really attacking ISIS. We're going to embarrass them by intervening and protecting Assad, and they're going after it. And that's the only good thing that Russia's doing in international relations. Their other agenda to prepare for World War III, the West, that includes taking back Ukraine and some of the other Eastern European states, of which they still have puppet leaders in every one of those. With the exception of Poland, they killed that leader who was an anti-Russian leader that was in that plane crash that was sabotaged. They killed the Polish leader. Now they got another puppet in there. But, Lech Walesa of Solidarity was a Russian spy. He was playing like he was on the anti-Russian side, and so was Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia. And so we know all of those things now and how sophisticated the deception was of the phony fall of the Soviet Union. But, unfortunately, people like Paul Craig Roberts and other people who are anti-globalist see Russia as the hero now because of what they're doing in Syria. And they don't understand that Russia's got a dual head now.
Yeah, exactly.
One is evil. They're still preparing weapons of mass destruction to strike the West, but they're doing a good job of stopping the globalist agenda in Syria, which I support.
Which is self-serving, too, because there's 5 different, if you want to call it Muslim republics inside the former Soviet Union, and Iran is a direct client. They can't see the client state of Iran falling to the West. So, they see Syria as the final block to Israel expanding, and they don't want to take over the territory. They just want to crush it and balkanize the Mideast completely for the sake of globalists. That's, Big Neil Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard, he stated that. It's in PNAC. They want to balkanize the whole Middle East so Israel can act as a proxy to control everything from oil and gas to God knows what.
Yeah, and so what we're seeing here is a Middle East that will never have peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, that's just a non-starter. In fact, the entire antagonism between Obama and Netanyahu is more feigned. Netanyahu's a globalist just like Obama.
Right.
But they have to prepare, to appear as if they're antagonistic one to another. This is a grand deception that's going on.
Well, I've talked to an anesthesiologist who personally was taking care of ISIS fighters, not in the military, but a regular Israeli hospital 5 months ago, and he's a dual American citizen. He told his parents, they said, get the hell out of there. People need to understand what's really going on is so devious and so manipulative. And even on 60 Minutes, they had one of their female journalists putting it to the Air Force general that they wouldn't even... They were literally bombing and moving around the rubble in old villages and so on in so-called territory of ISIS, when really they had no intentions of either buying the ISIS oil from the G20 nations or stopping bombing and moving rubble around. It's ridiculous. That's why when the Russians came in, they say, we'll embarrass you, and they're doing a very good job of it, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And it doesn't look like the U.S. is going to be able to get the Russians out of there, no matter how much they threaten. One of the interesting points, though, is that Erdogan of Turkey has said, openly, the reason we invaded, Syria was to take down Assad. And the problem with that is that, he's not going to be able to get away with that, with having, bandaged together that agreement with Russia. I mean, Russia's not going to let him take down Assad.
That's all. That's ridiculous. Russia basically, they'll do anything Russia says now.
Well, the real reason for the invasion, of course, was to take out the Kurdish support there that's their main target. So, Moscow said in response to Erdogan, hey, this is news to us. He's never, told us that he's in there against Assad, and we're not going to allow this to happen.
Right.
So I think the globalist agenda has been stymied in terms of getting rid of Assad. Now, does this stop the globalists from continuing to try? In the United Nations, they had several resolutions trying to create a ceasefire to save the rebels who are holding out in in Aleppo under the onslaught of the Syrian army, and Russia says they vetoed it. We're not going to let the ceasefire. We know what happens in the ceasefire, and the rebels continue to get arms and resupply from the United States, and we're not going to let that happen. They're going down. We're going to retake Aleppo and drive al-Nusra out. And I can't help but applaud that. Of course, the U.S. has, through the rebels, has been falsifying civilian attack charges against Russia and the Syrian army. For example, it's the rebels in Aleppo who will not let the civilians leave. They shoot people when they try to leave. They hold them hostage. They even move makeshift hospitals into areas where the rebels are fighting to invite Syrian and Russian air attacks so they can claim that, yes, the Russians just bombed another hospital. Well, it's the Syrian rebels that are putting those patients at risk by putting them in areas that are targeted. And so this is not the war that Americans would be taught. I mean, I can't believe the propaganda that continues to air every single day about Syria and barrel bombs and chemical weapons against its own people, and it's just not true.
I changed the new term. I call it, instead of propaganda, I call it propaganda. Because there's always an agenda behind the propaganda. Okay, next topic. What would you like to cover?
Well, let's see. The Brexit is really something that, the globalists are really trying to stop the Brexit. Now they've moved in with the UK Supreme Court, which is a new creation 10 years ago within the British Empire to have a Supreme Court like the United States Supreme Court. And they declared that the Brexit is null and void unless Parliament, votes. This, and of course, Parliament would not back, the Brexit, and so it's their way of turning around. But, they have tried every single stratagem to try to destroy the Brexit vote. The only reason, by the way, that the Brexit vote happened the way that it did, and it wasn't manipulated, is that they had paper ballots. It wasn't an electronic computer vote.
Okay.
And they underestimated, just like they underestimated the Trump backlash in the United States, they underestimated the EU backlash. They put off having a referendum for a decade, promising, and finally, they held Cameron's feet to the fire and said, give us that referendum, you're out. So he gave him the referendum. He was against it. Everybody was against it. Theresa May was against it. It passed. And the first thing Theresa May did after getting into the prime ministership, after Cameron resigned, was pass a bill in Parliament to inculcate all EU law into British law. So here the Brexit has just said, we're getting out of the EU, and then Theresa May says, we're going to pass a law inculcating all EU law into British law so that we can piecemeal take it away. Well, why do that? Why put it all in when it's very difficult to get rid of law once it's a part of British law? It shows that Theresa May is trying to sabotage this process.
Right.
But the government lawyers are going to town in the Supreme Court as we speak in these next 3 days, putting out the case. It's incredible to me that the Supreme Court could even make this case, because if you have a referendum law, what does it mean if Parliament doesn't have to abide by the referendum? Why have a referendum law
exactly
if it isn't binding on Parliament?
It should be. I don't know of a referendum that's not binding on Parliament or any government anywhere.
Now, what did you say?
I don't know of a referendum that's not binding on the government because it's represented by the people.
Well, that's right. The only thing it isn't binding on, as we found out in the United States, is the courts can overturn them.
Yeah.
And, from a constitutional standpoint, that is appropriate, that raw democracy cannot do something that is against fundamental rights. But what the courts have done is, for example, have defended the non-rights of illegal aliens. For example, in California, they turned back this referendum that said that illegals don't have access to medical care or free public schooling, and the court said you can't do that because that's a violation of their fundamental rights. What fundamental rights?
They have no rights. Yeah.
Free medical care or anything in the United States. They're illegal aliens.
They have the right to get on an aircraft or a boat or a train and be deported out of the countries. That's what they have rights for.
That's right. So it shows that, these globalists, everyone's rejoicing that, these globalists are on the run, but they're very, very powerful, and they haven't yielded yet, and they're not going to yield. They continue. That's why they're trying to co-opt Trump. That's why in Austria they banded together under the Green Party, of extreme leftists, to beat Mr. Hofer of the Freedom Party in Austria, and the whole globalists are rejoicing. The next battle is Marine Le Pen in France, who is threatening to win an election. They've got to stop her, and I think they will. And they're co-opting Trump so that most of his things will be compromised. So I think people who think that we're winning against the globalists need to really be careful, because these people are extremely powerful. And as I said in a speech just recently here in Utah, that, unless you really understand how the globalists operate, how they're embedded within the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, I mean, you really can't get rid of those unless you understand what you're really dealing with, and Trump doesn't understand. I mean, he could be assassinated, he could be undermined, they could pull the plug on the economy to destroy any ability to restore American greatness.
That's another issue, that the no vote in Italy, according to Leo Zagami and Harley Schlangers in Berlin, it suggests that this may cause a domino effect in banks in Europe. What do you think is likely to happen?
Well, we have to remember that the banks, worldwide are in a world of problem because of the derivatives, because of the excessive indebtedness of these nations, and especially it's never been resolved in Italy and Spain and Portugal, like Greece. It's just a matter of time. But, we mustn't underestimate the power to create fiat money to continue these bailouts. I don't think there's going to be an economic collapse. There will be a stock market correction. I mean, boy, that stock market is going so darn high now, can't help but self-correct. But I don't think it will end up in an economic collapse until war comes. War is the ultimate excuse to cover for economic collapse and a new world currency and all the kinds of changes that conservatives have been warning about, but I don't think they're going to come, including martial law, until war comes.
And that war you mentioned has to be with some kind of military parity, where Russia and China have reached a level where they think they can take on America and the West.
That's right. And I think the trigger event will be North Korea. There has to be a reason why North Korea is being allowed to get away with being the most tyrannical nation in the world, with nuclear weapons, with missiles to deliver them. Compared to Iran, we keep threatening with sanctions, but we don't do anything to to North Korea. Yes, we have new sanctions on them, but everybody knows that they can bypass those through China, and we don't have any sanctions against China. In fact,
why don't we have sanctions against China for doing this with North Korea? Why don't we do that?
It's because the globalists want to make sure that China and Russia continue to have the ability to build for World War III. They don't want to bring it to its knees economically, and they could. They could stop all of this trade with China and bring it to its knees.
Yeah, it could be stopped in a month, couldn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely could. But the globalists don't want that. They want China to be able to strike the West someday. Remember, it's their way of getting the West to finally accede to a militarized global government by absorbing a nuclear first strike here. Not on U.S. cities, but upon military targets, so that our leaders can claim that our military is decapitated. We have no defenses anymore except unless we join in a militarized global government to combat Russia and China. And that's what people will see someday. It's going to happen.
Yeah, I can see it coming.
I mean, it's very interesting. The U.S., is blaming Russia for everything now, yet they're still trying to get another disarmament agreement with Russia. If Russia was the enemy they're complaining about, why are they continuing to bend over backwards to disarm?
Yeah, well, America is disarming in spite of the fact that Russia is rearming and retooling their whole military and navy.
Absolutely, including massive new missiles and weapons of mass destruction, with such as the Satan II missile system now that's going to be in vogue before the end of the, or in production until before the end of the century. 18 warheads on it, high-speed maneuvering warheads, and the U.S. has nothing. Except, I take that back, and they not only disarmed all of our Minuteman III missiles, put one warhead on them instead of three. That's a two-thirds reduction in throw weight. They also just announced that they are going to build a new missile, but it's not going to be here until 2029. That's
kidding?
After this war starts, in my opinion. So
You've got to be kidding.
No. They're setting that thing off till they know that there'll be World War III in that weapon system.
Yeah, we figured. I think you figured and mentioned it in the past, the mid-20s, 2024, and there.
Yeah, mid-next decade, because most of the new weapon systems in Russia and China are coming online 2020, 21, 22, and 23, and so I don't think they're going to strike until those new weapon systems are deployed.
Now, what if Donald Trump fully operates the missile defense system that I know, having presidential level security clearance and being a doctor taking care of people at Space Command at Shreve Air Force Base, if they had fully deployed it, it would be impervious to any attack. But it would take an incredible amount of money and time. And if that system was deployed, it would make it impossible to have any missile strike American soil or any of our allies.
Well, the problem with this is that I've just talked to a missile engineer who works on our Aegis missile system. He said they're having a lot of problems with our missile casing. They're using carbon fiber instead of titanium casings, which are much cheaper, of course. But they're splitting.
That's what's happening with the Joint Strike Fighter, too. It would split and end up in the engines, and so they couldn't operate at full speed.
Yeah, and so, we don't have a warhead on any of our ABM systems. It's a kinetic hit vehicle, which is a solid piece of titanium hitting something.
Right.
But they have to make a direct hit in a super fast maneuvering warhead. There's no way you're going to make a direct hit. Yeah,
it's a very, very poor system. The theater air defense isn't very good. The next one is better, which is the plasma interferometry system in the upper troposphere with basically paramagnetic nanoparticles of thorium, strontium, barium, and aluminum. That's considerably better of disturbing the missile guidance systems. And the third is the Tesla death ray system, which I know that they were testing at White Sands Missile Base and Vandenberg in California. And that one is very, very effective, but they basically built almost none of them. And those are extremely capable of taking anything out and literally blasting it to smithereens at the speed of light.
Well, my point is I don't think these globalists are inducing and laying back and inducing this first strike because they tend to lose the war. I think they are going to deploy secretly some of these weapon systems, but they're not going to use them until after we've absorbed the first strike and when our leaders talk us into getting us to a global government, and then they'll pull out these weapons to stop any further attacks. That's what I think.
Yeah. In other words, they'll pull them out to stop after. And also, topics coming up this Friday.
Well, the newsletter's available on my website, www.worldaffairsbrief.com. And people can get a free sample issue simply by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. Coming up this Friday, I'm going to talk about emphasize one of the leaks that came out where Clinton admitted that ISIS was funded by the Saudis and the Qatars through clandestine funding and arming. Of course, that may or may not realize or indicate that she realizes that that funding is actually at the behest of the United States or the dark side of the U.S. government.
Right.
I'm not sure how much people like Clinton are actually told, so that they don't know what's going on. They're more yes men to the establishment. And that's one thing we have to realize. One of the things that I think about Mattis and Trump, just because they're so much against the Iran agreement, that indicates that Mattis couldn't be a globalist. Because a globalist wouldn't be against tearing up the agreement, knowing that it's a trap to set up Iran for a future attack.
Right.
And so even though he's a neocon and has been subject to an awful lot of anti-Iranian propaganda, these intelligence briefings that the president gets are just full of propaganda.
Right.
About Assad, and Iran, and they never tell them, of course, about what the globalists are up to and what the real agenda is. So I'm also going to be talking about this, recount on election. We thought it was dead. Stein is going before a federal court to try to get the Pennsylvania recount because she's basically dead in the water unless Pennsylvania is part of the recount. But they are trying to get electors to violate their oath and vote against Trump. So it's still up in the air. I personally don't think it's going to work just because the establishment seems to be, going along with Trump as president now and trying to co-opt him rather than try to actually dethrone him.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll tell you, I've got a strange kind of viewpoint that you might agree that Hillary Clinton was so in your face with her globalist policies, but if they can co-opt Trump to slide it in sideways over the next 1 or 2 terms, they'd prefer to do that than to get an angry public resisting what's going on.
That's right. Originally they never wanted Trump. They never wanted Clinton. They wanted to have a controlled Republican like Jeb Bush or John Kasich, etc.
Right.
That didn't happen, and now they're getting a Trump, but they're going to try to co-opt it and suppress the rebellion by basically...
Or just frustrate him, because...
Yeah, or frustrate it, right.
Yeah, for example, he's saying, I'm going to repeal Obamacare. It's not that simple to repeal it and replace it with something unless you do something structural, like I mentioned, the number of points that required you to completely change it beyond even the socialized healthcare systems of Canada and Europe, where the biggest problems are with a lot of issues, including NAFTA and so on. You have to repeal it and replace it. That's easy. But what I'm concerned about is, like, China says they didn't like TPP because they weren't included in it. So, Trump. So we have to really watch the ball here. If they get your newsletter, they'll know a lot more than they will if they just watch I call it the mushroom media. They keep them in the dark and they feed them BS.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's good to
Thank you, Joel. We'll have to have you back at least monthly. Amazing analysis of so many issues. Back in a moment with our second Health and Wellness Hour. Hour number 3, our news blog with Tim Alexander. Coming up tomorrow, Harley Schlanger from Berlin, from the LaRouche Foundation. Dr. Bob Thiel, hour 3 tomorrow. And coming up on Thursday, Leo Lanzagami following the no vote in Italy with Renzi's quitting. Lots of things to talk about this